The National Association of Realtors settled landmark lawsuits, agreeing to pay $418 million in damages and amend several rules around commissions. The implications could be widespread, not only for home buyers, but also for the number of companies and businesses in the sector. Let's bring in Ryan Tomasello, who is the Managing Director and Real Estate Technology Analyst at KBW, a Stifel company, to discuss more here. Great to have you here with us. Who is the biggest beneficiary as the result of this settlement?
I mean, thankfully, consumers. We think that these changes enacted in this settlement, if it goes through, are going to stand to reshape the housing market in the greatest fashion we've seen in over 50 years. Historically, consumers have lacked a lot of transparency around the process of how commissions are set and paid, particularly home buyers. And we think that these changes ultimately bring a lot more knowledge to home buyers in their ability to negotiate and sign off on those commissions. And then at the end of the day, hopefully that reduces commissions in aggregate by as much as 30% or more, we've estimated.
Ryan, to what extent is this going to reshape the housing market? And I ask that because we were talking to Jim Tobin. He was the NAHB CEO earlier in the hour. He's talking about the impact that he sees, at least, it having for home builders here in the longer term. How do you see that ultimately potentially boosting activity here over the next several months, or once it goes into effect in the summer?
Well, the plumbing of the housing market is certainly complex, and there's a lot of different stakeholders, whether it be home builders, as you point out, mortgage companies, title companies, maybe the more obvious players like the residential brokerages, and even the real estate portals that help consumers shop for homes. And we think that this ultimately stands to impact all of those stakeholders. Our focus has predominantly been on the impact to the traditional brokerage model and how that might need to evolve to adapt to these new rules and ultimately, support buyers in this new type of structure that brings them more transparency and hopefully more options in the types of services that they can ultimately use in the home search process. Now, for brokerages, that might entail a smaller commission pool for which they're competing around. And so that can certainly cause some disruption. And then perhaps just as interestingly, real estate portals that have historically relied more on the buy side piece of this commission pool for their revenue models. Companies like Zillow, Realtor.com, may need to reconsider their focus in the role that they play in the housing market and potentially shift that focus more to the sell side in terms of advertising homes. For home builders, as you point out, the question becomes if this overall reduction in friction costs around one of life's biggest transactions ultimately incentivizes more housing turnover, improves affordability. And certainly at the margin, we think that's true, but that will take time. And ultimately, we think overall macro supply and demand dynamics are going to play a bigger role for those types of players. But it certainly, shows you that this has a much far-reaching impact than just the traditional, broker players in this landscape.
Is this so significant then that it would change the perhaps price range that a potential buyer is willing to take on for a home?
Well, it's a very common debate around whether or not, commissions are built into the home price, and if those decline, do home prices actually fall? There's data that supports that on both sides of that coin. My personal view has been that, as we said earlier, home prices are set by supply and demand. To the extent that, these friction costs, commissions around the transaction are lowered, perhaps that does end up reducing home prices at the margin. I think another important factor here is that, there is going to be some added friction, especially near term for home buyers that may potentially be on the hook to cover the costs of their buyer agent's commission out of their own pocket. Now, sellers and listing agents will still have certain mechanisms to be able to reimburse the home buyer for the cost of those services. But to the extent that that does not occur on a case-by-case basis, some home buyers might need to reevaluate, whether or not they choose to work with an agent, how much they're willing to pay, the scope of services they're seeking out, a white glove service versus just a more basic type of offering, and how that ultimately plays into their own affordability equation around their home search process.
Ryan, what do you think it's going to do for employment within the sector, specifically realtors? There has been a number of projections talking about the fact that people are going to be ultimately forced to leave the industry given the fact that their incomes won't be anything like they were prior to this ruling. Do you have any idea just of what the impact is going to look like here on the employment level?
Yeah, I think if there's one thing industry folks tend to agree with most, it's that there's far too many of them, real estate agents across the country. Now, there's different estimates around how many, agents there are out there, anywhere from a 1.5 million to even 2 to 3 million plus by some other estimates. And a lot of those agents are more marginal, meaning approaching this business as more of a side gig, a side hustle to support other sources of income. And so, these marginal agents we think are the ones that might face a more near-term reality of whether or not they choose to stay in the industry based on, the cost of doing business going forward and how that needs to evolve. Ultimately, this stands to benefit the sub-cohort of agents that are actually the full-time, highest quality agents in terms of their ability to, reckon with maybe a smaller pie of real estate commissions, but ultimately getting a bigger slice of that pie, right? Because those agents will be the ones who will be best positioned to pitch their value proposition, win more business, and ultimately benefit despite the fact that this might cause this disruption on the commission pool.
Makes sense. All right, Ryan Tomasello, great to get your insight here. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us this morning. KBW, a Stifel company. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.